To wrap up the problem that we've been working with, we're going to practice making and interpreting our decision for the hypothesis test that we've been working on throughout this whole section so far. So, again, just to revisit our question one last time, is there a difference between the proportion of all Duke students and the proportion of all U.S. adults that would be bothered a great deal by the melting of our northern ice cap? I have our null hypothesis and our alternative hypothesis. Remember, U.S. adults, that was group 1, and Duke students, that was group 2. And then I also have the test statistic and the p-value that we found in the last video. We're going to need those things in order to answer this question. We are going to be using a significance level of alpha equals 0.05 because that's just our default level of significance. So the really nice thing about these types of problems and these hypothesis tests is that once we get past the calculation of the test statistic, the portion where we make our decision is still exactly the same. We're going to compare our p-value to alpha. And the rule that we use is if the p-value is less than or equal to alpha, then we reject the null hypothesis. We reject H0, and then, of course, if the p-value is greater than alpha, we do not reject H0. So we do not reject H0. So I'm going to compare my p-value that we said right here. This is one of the primary things I'm looking at. And then up above, I have the other one highlighted. We said alpha is 0.05. So alpha is 0.05. So first of all, my first question, is the p-value less than alpha? In this case, no, it is not. The p-value is not less than alpha. So what that means, if the p-value is greater than alpha, we do not reject H0. So kind of looking at these two things together tell me that we do not reject H0. Reject H0. So that's what I'm looking for my decision. Just to kind of talk about that again, because I think it is a good thing to come back and revisit. Remember that the p-value has a very specific interpretation. The p-value represents the probability that we end up with a sample like ours if the null hypothesis is true. So assuming that this H0 is true, what's the probability that we get a sample like ours or as extreme as ours? Well, if the null hypothesis is true, the probability that we get a sample similar to ours is roughly 83.18%. That's awfully high, which means that, sure, that seems like a reasonable thing to happen. So we should not change our minds. We should not reject H0. So if I'm going to talk about this, the decision and the interpretation of that decision are basically the same as we've seen. So we said already our decision was to not reject H0, and then if I was going to talk about that decision, if I do not reject H0, that means that there's not enough evidence to support the alternative hypothesis. So if I'm going to talk about this, we said do not reject H0. There is not enough evidence to support. And now I'm going to reference the alternative hypothesis. What was the statement that we were making here? Well, we said the proportion of U.S. adults is not equal to the proportion of Duke students that would be bothered a great deal by the melting of the northern ice cap. So that means that there is not enough evidence to support that the proportion of U.S. adults that would be bothered, we got a long one here, bothered a great deal by the melting of the northern ice caps of the northern ice caps. So this proportion is different than than the, I'm just going to say the proportion of Duke students. So we do want to make sure that we talk about what that alternative hypothesis means in terms of my problem. In this case, it was quite lengthy. I am going to be looking for you to use that word proportion of and proportion of because we have two separate proportions. And remember that when we interpret this decision, we always want to talk about it within the context of our alternative hypothesis. We're talking about there either is enough evidence to support it if we reject, or there is not enough evidence to support it if we do not reject.